Can I just say something?
Of course you can.
It's very interesting, the film that you showed, Yasha, because you know that Mira actually had at one point had the strong desire to make film. She never was able to get the sort of equipment or learn how to do it, but she wanted to do that. So instead, she produced these little books where you turn the pages and you see the movement of the line and or the letter, and it with an effect very like a film. So that was fascinating to see that. Yeah.
Do you think she had the intention of moving from the flick books towards an animated film that would be very similar?
I think it would have been actually a film. I mean, a projected film.
Very interesting. And you just found this. I feel like I have to ask because people are probably curious. You just found it sort of by chance.
Yes, ready-made.
Fantastic. We've got, I think, about 20-ish minutes before breaking. So I just thought I might ask a couple of questions, see how we go, and then just make sure that there's time for... I feel quite certain that people are going to have questions for both of you. So one question that I might ask to try and make a relationship between the two presentations was this concern with the void, the full void that Guy mentioned, the sense of something being at once everything and nothing. And you can relate this within the world or the universe of concrete poetry to Dom Sylvester Huedard. Do you think this was a tendency within the wider field of concrete poetry to be concerned with kind of emptying out language from its confidence in having the power to explain, of somehow questioning the capacity of language or the limits of language?
What a difficult question. I wouldn't know where to start, really. I'm sure there were some people that would question every full stop. But concrete poetry, that's why we have this map. It's because people came to it from every angle, you see. And so for some people, a full stop would be like microdot photograph, which has everything in it. And for other people, it would be the last thing, after which there would be nothing else. Mm-hmm. And so it depends on the people. And concrete poetry, as a movement, attracted people from lots of walks of life, partly because they could do it by themselves, because it really didn't cost money. I mean, if you think of what Dom Sylvester Huedard did, and he did an enormous quantity of concrete poems on his typewriter. And he was in Prynich Abbey in Gloucestershire, and I often wondered, as I saw the quantity of his output, didn't he have to do any work there in Abbey? Or wasn't he somehow employed? And I think that maybe he wasn't. Maybe he just was there, and they treated him as their sort of Abbey artist and let him get on with it. They didn't pay too much attention to the work, and it was sent out all over the world. But after he died, nobody could go and look at it anymore. Suddenly it became precious. That was quite interesting. So it wasn't at all precious because there were just bits of paper, and the typewriter with the red and dark blue ribbon, and of course that was getting worn out, and there are some poems where the blue and the red don't show up very much, or where the red shows up more than the blue, because that's what he was using more. So this is the kind of thing. So what he had to do was to beg from his friends enough money to buy a ribbon or postage stamps to get that stuff around, and so on and so on. And now, of course, there's a conference about Dom Sylvester Adar, South London Art Gallery on the 2nd of December. Whole day devoted to him.
Another thing he did was, because he always used an Olivetti lettera 22 to do all his typewriter poems. Where I don't know what it's called technically, but the roll,
Yes.
has a kind of ratchet on it. So
Yes.
he took the ratchet off so that he could roll it and all. He could sort of easily slip the paper into the type and take it out again.
So it wouldn't be one line after another. It was loose.
Yes, loose.
Yes,
exactly.
that's right.
That's right.
So you could
So
roll
he
it up
adapted
and
the
down.
typewriter in order to be able to, especially the ones that are the visual constructions.
Yes.
I think you're right. It's a really. I think I was thinking about this for the past couple of days, that you get a sense, both from his work, from Dom Sylvester Huedard's work and Mira Schendel's work, of having the ability to have large periods of time, which is something that the sort of the richness of time is something that's quite difficult to relate to now, and at the same time, I'm very drawn to the comparative kind of economy of materials and I suppose the agility that having this kind of practice allows, where you're able to carry on and you don't have the great kind of obstacles of needing huge material resources in order to work. And I was thinking of this in relationship to what you were saying, Guy, of the ability for you and Paul to go to Brazil, see the work and say, well, let's exhibit it. And Signal, similarly, always struck me as an organisation that had this capacity to be quite agile, a certain freedom.
Yeah. Well, we weren't quite so bound by administrative, sort of pressures and the extraordinarily complicated thing of everything became so much more complicated than it seemed to be then.
Became managed.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I'm idealising this historical moment. Perhaps I am. But it did strike me that the way you could respond to work at Signals, it wasn't a question of you didn't necessarily know what you were expecting, but you had a strong intuition that you could feed it into an overall picture of the art that you were interested in was. And similarly with concrete poetry, it wasn't something that had to be sort of managed and define itself and allow people within it as some kind of canon, but it was much more expansive in a sense.
We allowed
international,
for ephemera. The thing exists and then it stops existing. And it was somehow taken for granted. Like you mentioned Li Wancha. I remember his exhibition in Bell Street and Listen Gallery. And there was a room which consisted of a swing hung from the ceiling and a huge pile of autumn leaves. That was all. And if you visited, you sat in the swing, you swung, and you left. Do you remember that?
I do. I do.
And I wonder if we are able to come into any conclusions about whether Mira Schendel's work has anything to do with concrete poetry, or what it is that makes us ask that question. Is it just because there is language used in a visual sense, and therefore it is concrete poetry in a expanded definition?
The phrase concrete poetry seems to be a little bit more precise than visual poetry. Although I think visual poetry is probably a better title, because it can cover more.
Yes.
And more.
And have clay. Yes, any painter who used letters and words. It's true.
Was it an association that you made on seeing her work and knowing the context of concrete poetry in England and Brazil? When you saw it, did you make that relationship?
I don't know. I think I was interested in all use of the word, For example, Elio Oiticica was incorporating words in his Parangolais, which made them into visual poems, really, in one level, in one incarnation. But that very formal kind of concrete poem, I found fascinating. The one that you showed, the combination of the triangle and the rectangle.
Oh yes, Ernst Jandl.
Oh yes, that's
Yes.
right. And also the other thing was the poetry of punctuation.
Oh yes.
I didn't know about that.
Yes, that's wonderful. I mean,
How
there's a lot
far
of
was that
stuff.
taken? I mean, did it?
Oh well, the
'Cause
books.
Yeah. You
This
showed
was
a little.
Polish
Yes,
artist.
Yes. In Poland, there was a lot of visual poetry and concrete poetry. The term was never used, of course. And also in Czechoslovakia, there was a lot.
And I think you remarked at a certain point that you now, in the present day, associate a kind of the sense that concrete poetry is something to do with the future of language, that it somehow points towards the status of language now, which I think is something that quite a lot of concrete poets see themselves as, or saw themselves at the time as somehow kind of predicting a future in which language would be used differently, in which our relationship to language would be very different.
Yes, I think Dom Sylvester, when he wrote prose,
Yes.
he had a style that was very particular. I mean, it's full of abbreviations and sort of because it was,
Yes.
it was in motion really. So.
Yes. Yes.
And you would associate that with what? I suppose we can...
Kinetic. I mean,
yeah.
he called it King Kong, kinetic concrete. King Kong.
I think that we should take some questions from the floor, presuming there are some.
I think people are tired.
Just to break the ice, I was quite. It's always really hard to kind of imagine what the type of exchanges, friendships and correspondences were like 40, 50 years ago. But I'm quite interested in discovering these kind of often quite informal meetings and often through sheer coincidence, and there's a kind of it seems to me that there was a kind of amateurist in the best possible sense of the word, kind of context around a lot of this type of correspondence, whether within artistic circles. Most certainly through kind of experimental photography, for example, and I'm wondering if that also happened in terms of the circuits of concrete poetry. I'm thinking particularly in the amateur photographer clubs, which became a kind of international phenomenon. I mean, people would exhibit in these kind of very low-budget organized exhibitions, but photographs of people would travel the world, and it was a kind of an international network of. So I'm kind of thinking whether that is a kind of good example to in which to kind of be able to imagine how exchanges within avant-garde poetry or even amongst avant-garde artists took place.
I think there was a sort of connection between concrete poetry and mail art.
Yes.
Sending work through the mail, a method which was very beautifully developed by Eugenio Ditborn in Chile. But he really did originally start making his airmail paintings in order to to exhibit them in different parts of the world without transport costs. But there was, but I mean, but there was, the journey of the work was part of the poetic of the work. The journey was traced on every envelope as the work went from one place to another.
I think the key to all this is paper. You know, if it's paper, photograph is paper, etc., it will travel. It can be cardboard, but still paper. True. I think that is the key. And that is the basic material for most art, or what we start with.
I got very used to these airmail envelopes coming from Brazil, the green and yellow airmail.
Have you kept them?
I kept a few, yes.
I think there's something also that is of relevance to Mira Schendel's work as a whole, that in a way she was an amateur, or she was not professionalised, which is a sort of a good reason to be an amateur. And the universe of concrete poetry was almost like a giant open submission exhibition, in a sense. And I think that perhaps this is why the work causes so many contradictions. It's because she wasn't directing it towards a sort of certain presupposed professionalised box, but that, like concrete poetry, like these other kind of universes of interconnected practices, she was able to sort of circumvent somehow being within I'm a professionalised artist box and producing the work in her kitchen or through discussion and exhibiting it in not only in kind of gallery context in a way. Mm. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
Guy, I was very glad that you explained how she acquired all that rice paper, because I kept thinking it must be very expensive to get to Brazil. Do you think there's any possibility that her, and I can't say the word in Portuguese, the little nothings, the knotted papers, were rejected works?
No, well, they didn't have any marks on them. I mean, they were... So
she must have gotten a huge amount of rice paper.
Unless inside somewhere, because they're very dense, and maybe inside somewhere.
I mean, she must have had them, because she made hundreds and hundreds of those monotypes, and then you can conceive of how much paper those little nothings would have...
They're so thin that actually...
To twist them around and turn them into something.
There'd be a lot contained in a pile that high would be a lot.
So she must have had either massive... I mean, someone really gifted her something. It was just an amazing kind of...
Who gave it to her? Do we know?
No.
She just says a gift from a friend, I think.
Something like that, yes.
But presumably it would have been in Sao Paulo amongst the kind of materials you would have found in the Japanese quarter of Sao Paulo, for example. This is from my imagination.
I think it was probably Mira Schendel that brought it from his trips to China.
Interesting. So what was that? That it could have been from Mario Schenberg via his travels outside of Brazil to China and Japan. We'll find out one day.
I'd like to link two things together to address both of you. The question of the void, and I'm just thinking of a completely different tradition of thinking the void. I'm just Maurice Blanchot as Writing the Disaster, which is a book looking at a topology with an extreme limit, which is the void, and both at catastrophes at a cosmological level, but also using Winnicott and the void, the fear of breakdown or psychosis. So a kind of void at the heart of subjectivity is a kind of traumatic wound. And I want to link this with this idea from somebody, I'll use Nietzsche, that with the death of God, the way the brain is, the subject is structured, will be reflected in the way language, so grammar shouldn't be there in the same way after the death of God, living through the period of the death of God historically. So the idea that grammar and subjectivity and the way language is structured is very linked with being held in place or confirmed by a sort of higher being. And I just wonder, clearly what's come to me from all the papers in the last 2 days is that Mira Schendel was very she had a kind of mystical jouissance, perhaps this is what I'm picking up, without knowing her and her work, which protected her against that kind of understanding of the void. You know, some kind of primordial wound that might be inflicted by language at the birth of subjectivity, or any sense of the void as a catastrophic, whether it's the Big Bang or dark black holes or psychical black holes, or even the antagonisms, political antagonisms, if you think of the catastrophe of Europe that she escaped from. And yet this isn't somehow, I mean, her work isn't decorative, but she's incarnating or manufacturing a sort of something which is a full void, but it doesn't have the agonism or the disorder, a terrifying disorder, the terror of uncertain meaning that one might get if you see, you know, language breaking down, like a missing signifier for a psychotic. You know, just can't protect you from the real. So, you know, hallucinations are the protection against this, against the void. So I just am very interested as to, this has been sort of absent from the discussion. And considering her life, it's strange that it is absent. I can understand it being absent in her discourse or in her conversations, because, you know, trauma is not, you know, it's something that you repress, have to repress. But I just wondered what you make of this, because I feel that the Zen or the mysticism is perhaps a different enjoyment or jouissance of the void than one that confronts the... Okay, you've got it.
Yes, I've got it. Work is the protection against the void. And that's what she did. We've already agreed she did a lot of it, and all the time. So I think that would be my answer. Not the only one, but mine.
There are some things of Mira's that I don't really know why she produced them, and if I'd just seen those and nothing else of hers, I wouldn't have been interested at all.
Do you think of anything in particular?
There's those mandalas and things she was doing in the end, which don't seem to be interesting as forms or in their colouring. And I couldn't associate them with her. But obviously, in some way, she liked, maybe it's just a sort of assumption of freedom, but yeah. she liked to get concerned with all kinds of things which don't seem to have a lasting interest. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm being unfair there, but you know how you either the way in which you respond to something. And my first view of one of her monotypes and its emptiness still remains as something very, very powerful.
But if you'd met her at a different moment when she was producing the more, something like the mandala works, that attraction would not necessarily
there wouldn't
occurred.
have been any attraction.
I think there's a relationship between what you're saying, Jean, and Guy's reading of the void, maybe not as an explicit relationship to Schendel's own trauma, if you like, but the fact that the more that this understanding of the void is like turning around the void as something to be feared in a crisis and turning it into something you can live with, turning uncertainty into something you can live with. I think it makes sense to me. I think maybe if it hasn't been talked about explicitly today, it's somehow been there as something to be grasped about. A way of making sense of her biography as well, because these are kind of a set of very extreme circumstances that would obviously have affected her relationship to language in particular, and that sense it gives you of belonging to a certain place or even a certain conception of what's real, I suppose. I don't know if this is common. Again, I'm sorry I keep on asking these general questions about concrete poetry, whether there is a common tendency that those that contribute will also have passed through more than one language in their lifetime, or have been kind of split from their native language, if you like.
Yes, yes, certainly. I mean, for instance, Gomringer, born in Bolivia, educated and living in Bern. And then he writes the poem Silencio, and he's always writing in Spanish. And then Ben keeps on writing in Spanish. That's quite interesting. And so on. So, because language travels, but not terribly accurately. So the word spirit doesn't mean l'esprit, and so on. So this is, so if you need l'esprit, you put it in an English poem, that kind of thing.
Another thing, one thing that came up, one thing that I think Brian Fair was asking or talking about yesterday, legibility and illegibility. I suppose one could apply that to something like Schwitter's Sonata, because it and the borderline between intelligible and intelligible and unintelligible sound.
But you mean intelligible, you mean that it has to have recognizable words, but it doesn't really.
No.
Maybe you have it's a question of whether you can be sure of what it means.
Yes, well, Fumsbever, I mean, I don't know what, but when you hear it, you know, you imagine.
Quite a lot of words are onomatopoeic anyway, that they conjure up a sound.
Yes.
And there's a transcript of the Sonata, I think.
Oh, yes. Oh, what do you mean, translation into...
No, a transcript. It's a scripted script version.
Oh, yes, absolutely, there is, of course. And what I showed was just a little bit of it. And there are people who travel around the world performing it, because it requires very special talent and voice. And, you know, it's like performing music, or like being an opera singer. You perform Schwitter's.
I heard it performed at the Royal College of Art by somebody. Perhaps it was one of these people who travel around. It was quite incredible.
It is incredible.
It really was.
It is incredible.
I'm going to see if there's maybe one final question before we break for tea.
Sorry, less a question, more just an observation that was brought out just now by Eurasia when you were talking about language traveling not well. And that's, in a way, reflects back exactly to one of the speakers yesterday who was talking about how Mira would use whichever word in whichever language was most appropriate. So maybe she was always speaking concrete poetry and just didn't know.
It's that natural language.
Yes,
Nice.
I was wondering why she was suddenly... You know, there are some words in Portuguese, and then there's this whole sentence in Italian, you know. So.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was a beautiful question to end with. So,
Yes.
how long are we breaking for, Tanya?
I think we're breaking for 45 minutes.
45 minutes, and then...
And then the projection.